Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Let's settle down for a minute. Hi, everybody. My name is Reggie Ramos. I am the Executive Director of Transportation for Massachusetts. We are a coalition working for a better, more just transportation system across the Commonwealth. This is a very exciting panel we have today. So Money Train, we started Money to talk about pressing transportation issues that are relevant to the communities of Massachusetts. And today's panel is not an exception to that. Before we go into our panel today, I would like to thank GBH for lending us their platform and allows us to reach a wider audience. I would also like to thank our moderator and panelists for lending us their time and expertise so we can have this discussion about autonomous vehicles. And most especially, I want to thank you all of you who follow Money Train. You have made this endeavor truly worthwhile. Now let me get to it. On that note, let me introduce you to our moderator for today. I turn you over to the global transportation correspondent of the World and GBH News, Jeremy Siegel.
Thank you so much, Rick. And hello, everyone. Welcome to the Newsfeed Cafe at the Boston Public Library. And welcome to everybody who's streaming us online on YouTube. This is a fascinating moment to be having a conversation about autonomous vehicles and self-driving cars because in many ways, the future is already here. And in New England, I feel like we're kind of in the calm before the storm. Self-driving cars are already buzzing around San Francisco, LA, Phoenix, Austin, other parts of the world. I just returned from a reporting trip to China where I was reporting on, among other things, their self-driving cars. Robotaxis could be making their way to Boston next. If you were driving around the city earlier this year, you might have noticed those Waymo vehicles that are hard to miss. They have the cameras on top, they're all white, and they were surveying the city's streets. Now Waymo has completed its first round of testing and data gathering on our roadways. But Boston and the Commonwealth, more broadly, don't really have a plan for these things or a regulatory framework for these things that are predicted to revolutionize transportation. There's no clear regulatory framework, just a couple of bills pending on Beacon Hill, despite the fact that by all accounts, the entry of robotaxis into urban life is inevitable. So today we have the unique opportunity to hear from a panel of incredible experts on this issue about what we should know before the technology operates in our city, what autonomous vehicles are, how much of our city life they'll actually change, what their entry into Boston will look like, and how we can mitigate the negative effects and leverage their benefits. We'll also be taking questions from you in the audience today, here in person at the Newsfeed Cafe, and from online comments if you're streaming us on YouTube. So you can post those if you're on YouTube. Also, my colleague Annie is over here in a white sweater. She's waving right now. You can come up to her if you have a question. You can fill out a slip with your question, and I'll be able to ask it up here. Or when we open up the floor for questions, there's a microphone nearby Annie. I'll let you know when that's happening, and you can line up there and ask your questions. So without further ado, I want to introduce the folks joining me here on the stage this afternoon. Darlene Lambos is the president and principal officer of the Greater Boston Labor Council. Darlene, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Mark Fagan is a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and leads the school's Autonomous Vehicles Policy Initiative. Mark, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure, thank you.
Stephanie Pollack is the former Federal Highway Deputy Administrator and Secretary of MassDOT. Stephanie, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And Jeffrey Tumlin is the former Executive Director of the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, or SFMTA. Jeff, thanks for being here.
Happy to be in Boston.
So, Mark, I wanted to start with you to sort of set the framework for what we're even talking about here, because the question, what are autonomous vehicles, is a little more complex than you might think. There's sort of different levels of how autonomous cars, which you can see on this image that we're about to put up on our screen, you can see there are different levels for the way they work, and that can be confusing. So break it down for us a little bit. At a basic level, what should we know about autonomous vehicles that are already operating in several American cities?
The most important thing to understand about autonomous vehicles is we've all been driving them for a long time, but different levels of autonomy. The Society of Automotive Engineers has created a grading system to be able to determine what level of sophistication automation we have. What you can see on the screen, what we've highlighted, is level 4 is where there's no one in the driver's seat. That is the real differentiator for autonomy that we're talking about here today. So you get in a vehicle, it takes you from point A to point B, no one's in the driver's seat.
And these are things that are already on the road in San Francisco, LA, Phoenix.
That's correct, absolutely.
So you have some videos also here, Mark, showing your own experience riding robo-taxis. Let's put those up on the screen, and maybe you can just walk us through your personal experience, because a lot of us in Boston have never ridden these things. So let's put it up there and tell us about how you felt being in the back seat, not the driver's seat.
Exactly. So the context of this is being in a Waymo. I was with my daughter, who had never been in one. She's been in San Francisco for a long time. You'll notice the steering column. This is a Jaguar, which in and of itself is kind of interesting that that's the vehicle they've chosen. Here, I want you to observe what happens. There's a car standing in the lane. The autonomous vehicle waited for the truck to come, went across the center line, and returned back, which is kind of impressive. Here, you'll notice there are pedestrians, and the vehicle is stopping appropriately. This next one, you'll again see some pedestrians, but you'll also notice the vehicle started before the pedestrian was fully across the street, which raises an interesting question around how they're programmed and the norms for driving that they're utilizing.
I want to get to our other panelists in just a sec, but watching those videos and the other videos I've seen of these, I'm always kind of weirded out that there's still a steering wheel, and it's almost like these invisible hands are operating it. How exactly does the technology work, and why are there still steering wheels in fully autonomous cars?
At this stage in the game, we're using existing vehicles, and so you have the normal steering column, et cetera. The way in which it works is it works a lot like you and I. It's kind of amazing. It's using LiDAR, radar, video cameras, and other sensors to essentially have the view that you have when you're driving, but it's all been coded into zeros and ones. So it's really the ultimate in artificial intelligence.
Jeffrey, you have firsthand experience with robo-taxis, actually being on the streets of your city, navigating this new world of transportation. I think one of the confusing elements for me of this is, like, we just saw a Jaguar up there. It's operated by Waymo, which many people might know as Alphabet or Google. But then there are other companies. There's Tesla, there's Zoox, run by Amazon, series of international companies, many of them in China. Explain to me what we know about the different technologies for autonomous driving and the safety element of them, like how they make sure that their vehicles are safe, and how that's complicating our understanding and regulating of AVs.
Well, sure. So there's a lot of different business models out there, and I think the easiest point of comparison may be between Waymo versus Tesla. Waymos have over 30 sensors mounted on the vehicles that include camera, LiDAR, and radar. And the LiDAR and radar make it a lot easier for the vehicle to particularly detect pedestrians that may have gone behind another object, and therefore make it easier for Waymo in order to predict cyclist and pedestrian behaviors. Tesla just has a suite of cameras, 8 cameras, I think, on a Tesla, and Teslas tend to simply react to what they see in front of them. And therefore, Teslas get more readily confused, particularly in an urban context. For all of them, they operate really well under basic driving conditions. Like in Phoenix is not seeing anywhere near the level of problems with AVs that we're seeing in San Francisco, because Phoenix kind of looks like a video simulation of a city. Autonomous vehicles are great with basic driving, but they get really confused by anything that requires human intelligence, like interacting with a human traffic control officer. And because autonomous vehicles have defined safety merely as collision avoidance, when autonomous vehicles get confused, they simply come to a complete stop wherever they happen to be. And if they're confused by a human traffic control officer, they're going to come to a complete stop right in the middle of your most complicated intersection in the city during peak times. If they encounter an emergency operations scene, they will simply come to a complete stop in the middle of firefighters trying to put out a fire. And so it's one of the reasons why, as a city, we have been arguing that the vehicle still does need some way of having a human control it, because when these vehicles get confused, a human often needs to intervene, either in person or through telematics, in order to extricate that vehicle from where it has just stopped.
It's sort of hard to imagine how exactly that would work for, a lot of people are hailing these as robo-taxis, as Ubers or something. So you're getting in the car, there's no driver in there. So what would happen in one of those situations? Is it like the passenger who's in the back all of a sudden grabs the wheel to get it out of an emergency situation?
No, that doesn't work. But first responders are trained for how to deal with autonomous vehicles that have gotten into a situation where they and part of the burden that cities need to have in order to accommodate autonomous vehicles in their jurisdictions.
Stephanie, as Jeff mentioned, San Francisco is more difficult than Phoenix. I think it's probably safe to say that Massachusetts, Boston, is more difficult than San Francisco. You similarly have windy city streets. Many of them are super thin. And then on top of that, you have the weather. I mean, we have brutal winters here. You have a decade of experience leading state and federal transportation agencies. How are you thinking about how places like Boston could begin to approach a regulatory framework for autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, so the conversation in Massachusetts actually started a decade ago when some MIT spin-off companies wanted to test autonomous cars, not yet put passengers in them. And what we used to say is, we've got the trifecta here for perfecting your cars, right? Bad roads, bad drivers, bad weather. And one of the things that you need to understand about autonomous cars is they learn by driving, right? They get better at what they do. And so to some extent, you want them practicing safely, safely being the operative word, in a world of bad weather, bad roads, and bad drivers, because that's the only way they'll actually be able to navigate that world. So the way I think about it is there's sort of three phases in the interaction between government policy and autonomous cars, right? So the first phase is before you come onto our road, what do we want? Right now, the Federal National Highway Traffic Safety Administration governs that through something called the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards Program. This was designed long before autonomy was a gleam in anyone's eyes. It doesn't work particularly well, and right now the only federal requirement to put a car on the street is that it complies with the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards or gets an exemption. And that is actually the answer to your question of why do they still have steering wheels? Because you cannot get certified under FMVSS without brake pads and steering wheels. And while exemptions are possible, they have been very limited. But someday, manufacturers will start going for exemptions and they will ask to put cars that have no steering wheels or brakes. So that's the federal piece, right? In Massachusetts, to put a car on the road, the threshold is it has to be registered, right? Like, forget autonomy. For you and I to put a vehicle on the road, we have to register our car, right? And for you or I to drive that car, we have to get a driver's license, right? So one of the challenges from a government perspective is an autonomous car is both the registered vehicle and the licensed driver. But we haven't set up our system that way, right? So right now, if you get a registered car, there is actually no requirement that there be a licensed driver in the registered car. So there's a state piece, right? So the first question is, before it's even out there, what do we want to happen? And my guess is it wouldn't hurt to change some of our registration and licensing laws, but that may take a while. When we started 10 years ago, we actually did memorandums of understanding instead of going through the whole pass a law process. The second question is, when it's out there on the roads, what do you want the rules to be that are different than cars that have drivers, right? Those rules can be about data. Those rules can be about how you navigate through an emergency scene. Like, you have to make rules, right? And you have to be able to enforce those rules, right? So you may not realize this, but you get a ticket as a licensed driver in almost every situation. We don't ticket the car register, right? So if there's no licensed driver, who do you ticket? If the autonomous car is like exceeding the speed limit or parked in a bicycle lane or doesn't pull over when there's blue lights behind it, right? So the state kind of has to fix that, and that means the legislature has to act. That's not something the city of Boston. And then the last piece, which is really important, is you have to have a feedback loop, right? Because if the whole point is they're out there learning, right, then you have to be able to take the learning and not just ask that particular car manufacturer or company to make its better. You need a system, which I think involves the government at either the state or local level, to take that information in, right? So there's a case that gets cited sometimes where a Waymo sort of had a one-vehicle crash into I think it was a telephone pole. They shouldn't do that, right? And so that got worked out between the government and Waymo, like they recoded it so it didn't do that anymore. But for me, thinking from the government side, right, it shouldn't just be Waymo who then goes and writes new code to prevent that kind of crash. Like, there has to be a government role in talking to anybody who's putting autonomous cars on the road and making sure they also learn, right, from every autonomous car on the road. So those are the three pieces. What do we do before they even hit the streets? What do we make them do while they're on the streets so it's different than cars with licensed drivers? How do we take the data that gets generated while they're on the streets and create feedback loops that make them better and better?
So those are three big question marks, and as you said, they'll take time to figure out. At the same time, we already have Waymo testing here. How soon do you think we're going to have autonomous vehicles truly operating around here?
Well, I mean, right now, Massachusetts is one of a minority of states nationwide that has no statutes, right? So 30-something states have some kind of a state legislation on autonomous vehicles. Massachusetts isn't one. So unless either the state or the city negotiates some kind of a binding memorandum, the truth is anyone can come to Massachusetts right now with an FMVSS vehicle that passes federal laws, that's registered in Massachusetts, and they can start driving around.
I want to begin to talk about the pros and cons of self-driving cars. And Darlene, I'd love to bring you in here because there's a human element that I think we haven't touched on yet. And Stephanie mentioned, with registration, you're registering a car and you have the owner, the driver of the vehicle. Right now, all of the cars we have on our street, people are driving them. When you hop in an Uber, a person is driving that car for you, you're paying them. Or when you hop on a bus, you have a bus driver, somebody who's being paid to do that job. If you imagine a future where we have autonomous vehicles driving us everywhere, that means that all of those people no longer have a job. How are you thinking about this future and what it means for the workforce?
Yeah, I think what we'd like to not imagine that future, actually, because we want to make sure that the drivers that are driving the cars still have jobs. And so our group called Labor United Against Waymo actually has tried to make a case that the technology isn't there, that there are certain costs for safety and issues around particularly tens of thousands of drivers that could be out of work. And these are humans. These are parents who are trying to put their kids through school, who are trying to buy groceries, who are just trying to make ends meet. And if we need to answer and study the impacts on drivers and on our economy. And in particular, one of the other things that we really advocate for is public transportation. I mean, this panel is about public transportation, and we don't want to see just driverless cars. I want to point out driverless, because autonomous vehicles is kind of this framework that kind of takes out the human part of the impacts that we're seeing around driverless cars. So I want to encourage everyone to actually say driverless cars, because that will be what will happen. We will have no more drivers that care about our community, drivers that contribute to the local economy, drivers that help people with disabilities and elders take their groceries in and out of the vehicle. That's not going to happen with driverless cars.
I want to get to you in a moment about this, Jeff, because you have experience sort of with the interplay of public transportation and driverless cars. But Stephanie, have you been watching, or Darlene rather, have you been watching what's unfolded in other states and what that means for the workforce?
We definitely have. I mean, we've seen, in particular, public transportation. There's obviously public transportation also employs lots of drivers, and about 430,000 across the country. And we worry that a public transportation system and driverless cars could compete with a public transportation system. So we don't want to see those folks out of jobs either. Not just the app drivers. Our our drivers here who have just formed a union, who are just trying to make sure that Uber and Lyft actually negotiate in good faith around wages and benefits and working conditions. We need unions to make sure that workers have a fair say in their jobs. And that's what's going to happen. We're not going to actually have humans to be able to organize and work with and be able to build that kind of voice for all workers here in the U.S. And so we're concerned about that for sure.
Jeff, what have you seen in San Francisco? Are self-driving cars already taking away jobs?
It remains to be seen. Right now in San Francisco, the scale of service is relatively small, so I don't want to overstate the impacts. What we are seeing, though, on the labor front is particularly challenges relative to serving passengers who use wheelchairs. So back in 2013, when Uber and Lyft were both promising that they were going to reduce congestion and improve service for people with disabilities, they didn't intend to destroy mobility for people in wheelchairs, but a secondary consequence of their arrival in the marketplace and the displacement of city-regulated yellow cabs meant that there was a dramatic reduction in wheelchair-accessible passenger transportation in San Francisco, because much of that was being served through city-regulated yellow cabs. We're seeing similar things maybe starting to play out since have a strategy for accommodating passengers in wheelchairs. We're also very worried that those promises of solving congestion and making transit work that we heard endlessly from Lyft back in 2012, those same promises are being put forward by autonomous vehicle companies. And the result that we saw last time around was a dramatic worsening of ridership on public transit, worsening of congestion, a worsening of automobile dependency. Because of this tension between user convenience and transportation system efficiency. Uber, Lyft, Waymo, really good at user convenience. And if all autonomous vehicles is just Uber and Lyft at a lower price point, then we're actually worsening the transportation system rather than solving for congestion or other factors.
Stephanie, how are you thinking about the pros and cons? I mean, I think I've also heard an argument that you have a number of these vehicles, if they're able to be made extremely safe and efficient, you might not have as bad of traffic. You might not have people causing traffic. You'll have self-driving cars going smoothly through the streets of Boston. Do you think they could lessen congestion? And what other elements are you looking ahead at?
So I, like most transportation professionals, don't actually start with congestion. I start with safety. Mm-hmm. Human beings driving cars kill 100 other human beings daily in the United States of America, in large part because they are distracted, or they are impaired, or they are speeding, or otherwise not, in fact, following the rules. The truth is, there is a possibility, and not a guarantee, there is a possibility that technology, whether it's fully autonomous cars or partially autonomous cars, what people are now starting to call software-driven vehicles, right, where the software is making sure you don't change lanes at the wrong time, where the software is braking for a pedestrian, where the software is slowing you down if you go too fast, right? They have the potential to make cars safer, right? Like, that's what I don't want to lose. I don't want to lose the potential, and we can't compare, you can't ask, will autonomous cars kill no one? You actually have to say, how much better do they need to be than people at driving? And people are terrible, okay? In the United States, by the way, we're much worse than the rest of the world. Then on the congestion, I mean, so that's the first criteria. If they don't make the world safer, they shouldn't be out there at all. If they do make the world safer, but they also create other problems for the transportation system, we should also address the other problems. But I just want to reinforce what Jeff said, which is the introduction of ride-hailing has made the system in cities worse, right? So the most recent study is that 40% of all miles driven by Uber and Lyft driven by people are miles without another person in the car, no passenger. So if you ask me, are they driving more miles around cities like Boston today with drivers? Yes, they are. Is that contributing to congestion? Yes, it is. So again, the baseline, we have to separate the issue of not having drivers, which is a legitimate policy issue that we should address, from the issue of what's the criteria we're going to use to decide. And for me, you start with safety, then you do congestion, and the baseline is not comparing it to perfection. The baseline is comparing it to how things are working today with cars, with drivers.
Mark, how safe is the technology right now?
Technology has gotten a lot better. As Stephanie points out, we have a small sample. In that small sample, we've had one death. It's tragic. But that same day, 100 people also died in the United States from car-related. So it's getting better, and it's continuing to get better. But I want to address the issue around how we integrate these kinds of vehicles into the fabric of the city. Because regulation actually has the ability to address many of the issues that have been discussed. One type of regulation says we don't allow autonomous vehicles to compete with public transit, rather they collaborate. There are a lot of public transit locations where there's a first mile and last mile problem, where you don't live immediately adjacent to a T-stop like we have right here. And having a shuttle, which is also an autonomous vehicle, may well be a way to enable people to more effectively use public transit. So that's one example. A second example of regulation is you could regulate what the locations are where you're picking up and dropping off people, as well as setting pricing associated with the route. So if, for example, you have someone who's originating right here in Copley and getting off at Government Center, when there's a perfect, efficient, fast transit, you change the pricing and you don't allow it to be at the very low level. Yet if you're in a location that doesn't have public transit, then having an autonomous vehicle at a lower price point compared to Uber and Lyft today could well enable people who are at the lower economic strata to be able to have the same kind of access to the city as many of the rest of us do.
We're in a unique situation in Boston where we are, it seems like, a little bit behind when it comes to figuring out a regulatory framework. But I do think that presents some opportunities for getting it right. Darlene, who do you think should be at the table as we're making these decisions?
Absolutely think that workers need to be at the table. The drivers themselves, the people that use public transportation, that people who want to invest in a broad public transportation that serves all, that serves everyone, that doesn't leave people with disabilities out on the curb, a transportation system that actually employs people with good jobs so they can contribute to the economy. We can't regulate ourselves out of 70,000 Uber and Lyft drivers who are going to be out of a job. I'm not sure how we can regulate more hunger, how to deal with more hunger. People are going to be hungry in this economic situation we're dealing with right now, where I'm even being asked to do some food drives for people who are dealing with making ends meet, even in union jobs. And so I'm not sure we can regulate ourselves out of dealing with people, tens of thousands of people who will be out of jobs. And I think that impact is going to be something that we're going to really need to contend with. And so I would argue that we should not have driverless cars without a full impact study on our economy, on our people, on our drivers, and on our communities. And who should absolutely be at the table are people who use public transportation and those who are the drivers and participate in those jobs.
Jeff, are there any lessons from San Francisco? I keep thinking back to, I used to live in the Bay Area, and we were one of the first cities in the US, or regions in the US there, that saw the introduction of, the little stand-up rental electric scooters, the scooter apps. And it totally transformed life around there. And then you saw it happen in cities around the US. It was like, where do these scooters come from? How do we regulate this? And I feel like we're seeing a somewhat similar thing with autonomous vehicles. Obviously, it's very different and involves a lot more regulation. But what has happened in San Francisco regulation-wise so far, and what can we learn from it?
So in San Francisco, there is no regulatory authority over autonomous vehicles, but we do have regulatory authority over scooters, shared scooters. And so San Francisco has been able to push industry towards solving the unintended problems with scooters, like riding on the sidewalk. Meanwhile, the California regulations, which are very laissez-faire, are letting the market dictate outcomes on city streets and are not flexible enough to allow either us or industry to manage for the unintended consequences. The lack of service for people in wheelchairs, the confusion that they experience with emergency response scenes or construction sites, as well as the congestion-inducing effects of them doing most of their pickup and drop-off in the traffic lane or in the bike lane. We have no ability to solve for these problems, but we know the solutions exist. And one of the things that Mark just talked about is allowing pricing to be built into the scenario in order to minimize the negative impacts on transit or congestion in the city core. It also means thinking about a stage gate approach where autonomous vehicle companies are limited in number by geography, time of day, and weather until they're able to demonstrate effective ability in order to handle these situations, right? Again, in a suburban context or a Phoenix context, there are so fewer impacts than there are in a place like central Boston. You need to be learning from the failures in California to be prepared to manage those unintended consequences, because simply letting the market do its thing is going to be chasing the convenience of the privileged rider at the expense of the transportation system as a whole.
Stephanie, what would you like to see Massachusetts and Boston specifically do as we approach regulation? You mentioned all the questions that are still out there, but what should be our target as we begin to navigate this?
So I think one of the challenges that we face in Massachusetts is that we have a lot of very close jurisdictions, right? Boston is a small city relative to its metro area. It's going to be hard to imagine an autonomous car that isn't going to end up in Cambridge or Brookline or on the Mass Pike or 93. So I think that the state, whether it's initially through some kind of memoranda or through legislation, if we can get it through the legislature, needs to help communities manage the part of the system questions that are the state's to manage without preempting the ability of a city like Boston, which is going to have issues that are unique to Boston, right? So one of the things we tend to do is we do a lot of either or in transportation, right? It should be a federal issue or a state issue. It should be a state issue or a city issue. What we need to do with autonomous vehicles, and quite frankly, a lot of other transportation problems, is the state needs to step in so that the rules that apply to more than one community are uniform. And the state needs to not tie the hands of communities who need to be able to protect their own citizens and manage their own roads. We need both. We need a state role and we need a local role.
Mark, how right now are we seeing the technology interact with people on the road? Because I think we hear, often hear about this future from electric vehicle companies like, electric cars are going to be everywhere, and once they're all there, everything will be totally safe. It'll be smooth sailing. But as they're operating in cities right now, they're driving on roads with other drivers. How well do self-driving cars work with regular driven cars?
So far, they're doing well. And be clear, we've made a determination that we're going to have the vehicle itself be capable of operating in an environment without a lot of communication back and forth. In 2016, when we were first talking about it here in Massachusetts, there was this idea of smart infrastructure. The traffic light would communicate with the vehicle and it would start to slow it down. Or potentially you could imagine vehicles communicating with each other. That's extremely difficult. It's hard to keep pace with the technology, especially at the municipal level. And so we've adopted the approach of the vehicle needs to do exactly what you do today. It needs to be independent and operate effectively. So far, we're seeing it does pretty well. Are there incidences? Absolutely. Are there incidences where I observe a driver today doing something incredibly foolish? Absolutely. We seem to be very willing to accept a human doing something idiotic, not so much for a piece of technology. And that's not a criticism. I mean, I want to make sure that Stephanie's point is they are safe, they got to be safe. But I don't think that at this stage is a limiter. I do think the issue around how you're going to regulate them, especially in Massachusetts, is because you can't really put them on the road effectively today.
We're going to go to audience questions in a few minutes, but before we do that, I wanted to ask each of you the same question and make you come up with a prediction. Darlene, I'll start with you because you've been saying you do not want to see these things on the road taking away jobs. But I'm curious, do you think we are going to see these self-driving cars everywhere? We keep hearing about this future where they're everywhere. They've been introduced in cities around the country, but it's still sort of a soft launch period. I mean, do you think it's possible to avoid that situation where we are seeing self-driving cars going around Massachusetts? What's your prediction?
That's a good question, because I'm not sure I can predict what I want to see happen, so we have to manifest what we actually want to see happen. And what we do want to see happen is a society that really cares for people, a society that puts people over profits, a society and a community that cares about what kind of work that we have, what kind of public transportation system we have that cares for one another. And I think the question here for this is in terms of what do I predict? I want to manifest that we will not ask the question whether or not Waymo should come, but what kind of society, what kind of community we want to build, and who pays the price if we do let them come in. So I think that in terms of predictions, I would predict that the unions and community organizations that want to continue to build an equitable and sustainable future will continue to fight against those that want to put profits over people. And so that's my prediction.
Hearing Darlene's prediction, Mark, made me think of the broader conversation of artificial intelligence, which I know is something that you're tracking, and this inevitability question. Is this just going to upend our lives, and is there a way we can stop it, or do we want to stop it? Do you think years from now, every car we see out here are going to be autonomous vehicles?
I don't. But I should caveat my prediction by telling you I think it was in 2018, I did a session like this in New York City, and someone raised their hand and said, when will we see autonomous vehicles in New York? And I said, well, by 2024, you should see about 5% of rides. Clearly, I was wrong. They are nowhere in. I offered to give a beer to everyone if I was wrong. So I owed a lot of beer to a lot of people in New York. In terms of the role of autonomous vehicles, I think it will be city-specific. I think you'll continue to see it and grow in places that are easy, like Phoenix. Here in Massachusetts, I think it's a longer, slower process. Lousy drivers, lousy roads, and lousy weather make this not necessarily the easiest place to do it. The one other thing I'll mention is there are something on the order of 300 million cars on the road today. Average age, about 11 years. Life expectancy of them, 22 years. It's going to take a very long time for cars to completely turn over.
Stephanie, do you think all of the issues you've raised about the lack of regulation and what needs to happen next is going to prevent Boston from seeing a self-driving revolution like we're kind of seeing in other cities?
So, and Massachusetts should be part of the revolution and should, I just watched the Ken Burns documentary last night, so just like we were part of the American Revolution, right? Because we pride ourselves on innovation, right? So there's a story that is probably apocryphal about Henry Ford going to a bank to try to get a loan to build the factory to build the Model T, in which the banker said to him, well, who would ever give up their horse? People will give up driving cars if autonomous cars are good enough, because on a user convenience scale, they work. So I'm actually less worried about a few hundred or even a few thousand autonomous vehicles on the roads in Boston and Massachusetts than I am about what I talked about before, which is the software-defined vehicles, because there are cars that are being sold right now and bought by people right now, and videos online right now where people are taking their hands off the steering wheels. And it is easier to deal with one company that wants permission to put autonomous cars on the city streets than it is to deal with hundreds of thousands of licensed drivers who right now are buying cars that brake automatically, change lanes for you, park for you, and some of which are marketing themselves as it's okay for you to take your hands off the steering wheel. So it's not that I think full autonomy is inevitable, but it's not about whether software-defined vehicles are inevitable. They are here today and being sold by the tens of thousands. And Massachusetts and Boston are either going to be part of defining how that innovation is on net a good thing for not only individuals but communities in the state, or we're going to get left behind. But they're there now.
Jeff, to ask you the same question in a different way, since you're experiencing this unfold in San Francisco, is the revolution already here? Is this as big of a deal, at least as self-driving technology and car companies want us to think?
I would say it is less a revolution than it is an evolution. And I would really like to emphasize Stephanie's point that this is a time for Boston and Massachusetts to lead, right? So you're fortunate that you are not the beta test site. You have the opportunity to learn from both the success and failure in cities like San Francisco, and to create a regulatory structure that embraces rapid innovation and embraces technology, but begins with upholding the public good. And that requires defining what you mean by the public good and how you want your cities to work.
All right, we're going to go to audience questions. The microphone is right here, and if you have a question, you can begin lining up. Also, if you're streaming on YouTube, you can put a question in the comments, and we'll do our best to get to them. You also, if you'd rather not ask a question on the microphone, my colleague Annie is up here in the white sweater waving, and you can bring a note up to her with your question. Before we do get to audience questions, I know we have a city councilor in the audience who would love to stand behind the microphone, and I'm going to ask you the question since we are not the beta site, and we have the opportunity to set the framework for how things can operate in Boston. How is the city government approaching this right now?
Awesome. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for this amazing panelist. Very informative. My name is Henry Santana, and I had the great honor of being one of the at-large city councilors here in the city of Boston. This past summer, I was proud to sponsor an ordinance, docket number 1432, which requires a public study on the potential impacts of commercial driverless vehicles on our city. This establishes an advisory council made up of drivers, small businesses representatives, transportation officials, police, and technology experts that shape any potential deployment and process, and an additional layer of accountability with human safety, with a human safety operator. This ordinance is about understanding the effects before deployment on jobs, local businesses, traffic, and public safety, and ensuring Boston residents have a voice in shaping these changes. It has been inspired by the tens of thousands of workers, some standing with us here today, across Massachusetts, that turn a key to earn a living, who have been sounding the alarm on the potential consequences of giving these vehicles free rein over our streets. Rideshare drivers organizing with the App Drivers Union in particular have been spearheading this effort. While they and taxi drivers may be displaced first, autonomous vehicles threaten the livelihoods of bus and train operators, delivery workers, and truckers as well. I do have a question, and my question is for Jeffrey. I appreciate you being with us here today. Boston has the opportunity to study AV impacts before deployment, implement informed guardrails, and avoid costly mistakes. You just talked about it in your last answer, and would love for you to expand it more. Given your experience in San Francisco, what would you have done differently to better manage AV integration? And I also know you just mentioned that Boston has the opportunity to be a leader here, so we'd love to hear your thoughts on here.
Thank you, Councilmember, for that question. So as I said before, the regulatory structure in California created a pretty laissez-faire situation that gives cities no ability to manage AVs. And I absolutely agree with former Secretary Pollack that you do not want to let cities run amok. You need to give cities the right lane in which to operate to deal with unique situations in their cities. So this is an incredible opportunity for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to really step it up and lead, learning from both success and failure, and work to accelerate the upsides of this technology while being very aware of potential downsides. Dealing with, for example, pickup and drop off when it is happening in the traffic lane or in the curb lane. Dealing with frail passengers or people who use wheelchairs, making sure that there is a strategy for serving them. And oftentimes that is simply going to require having a human there, and that is great because there are things that humans do incredibly well. Dealing with emergency response, and particularly dealing with emergency evacuation. We in San Francisco are very worried about what happens if the 5G network goes down as a result of an earthquake and the entire AV fleet simply bricks in our streets when we need to move people out of the city. We need to have a conversation about how to manage situations like that. And I think finally, managing the inevitable increase in congestion and vehicle miles traveled, we know the tools are available in order to capture the upside of connecting people to public transit via AVs, as opposed to simply staying in your giant bubble of an AV with your perfect tunes on while doing conference calls while stuck in traffic, paralleling the red line. That's a future that we don't want, but effective regulation can manage every single one of those problems, allow the technology to succeed while upholding public good at the same time. This is your chance.
Thank you for the question, Counselor. And I want to go to a question that we got online from a YouTube streamer. A power wheelchair watcher wants to know what research is happening to help disabled people ride independently. Mark, as far as you know, is there any research out there on how to make self-driving cars accessible?
There have been a number of design concepts that would enable, much like we do today, where the ramp comes down, wheelchair goes in, ramp comes back up. Still in the design stage, but that certainly is a potential for the longer term.
All right, we'll go to our next question from the audience. Thanks for coming.
Hi, Brennan Carney, Executive Director of Walk Massachusetts. Here in Massachusetts, there's been endless conversations about transportation funding, but bills that have been filed at the State House attempt to exclude AVs from Uber and Lyft fees. These are for-profit companies, and in California, they've been reticent to share non-redacted data since they claim the algorithm is a competitive advantage. What additional info should these companies be required to be sharing with MassDOT and municipalities to help create safer streets before crashes happen for everyone not in those cars?
Stephanie, do you think you could take this one?
So I think I said the first question is, what is the rule before we let you on our streets? And I think data is thing that we should, as a state and a city, we should define. Like, that should be part of the deal, right? And right now what happens is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration collects some data under what's called the Standing General Order, which actually has been continued under the current administration, but it's not enough because it's focused on a subset of crashes, right? And just like the cars need to learn from their experience on the streets, we need to learn from the cars' experience on the streets. And the way we do that is we get data. There is no doubt. I mean, this is where the fact that we're really smart in Massachusetts should help. There is no doubt in my mind that we can design a data requirement for autonomous vehicles that protects proprietary information and gives policymakers and the public more information than the feds currently collect. And that's one of the places where we could really shine as a city and a state in striking that appropriate balance between promoting innovation and making sure the public has the information it needs to make smart policy decisions. We need better data protocols. I would not rely exclusively on the data that the feds currently collect from companies.
Mark, it seemed like you wanted to jump in with something there.
Well, in California, one of the tools that was used as autonomous vehicles were being introduced was a disengagement report. So every time an autonomous vehicle was disengaged from autonomy into manual, it was required to provide information about what the situation was. And on the surface, that is a brilliant idea. In execution, wasn't so well done. I actually use that data set as an example of how you don't necessarily want to design a data set, but to pick up on Stephanie's comment, There's a ton of information that could enable us to be a lot smarter about how we bring these on. And I would agree, part of the regulatory framework needs to be what that data set looks like.
Yeah, and I want to come back to one real clear example to help people understand. So we know a lot about how people fail and cause safety problems, right? We fail by being distracted, we fail by, okay? There are things that are different. So we've all heard about artificial intelligence and hallucination, okay? So one form of hallucination for autonomous vehicles is phantom braking, right? Because they're designed to be as safe as possible. If they think there's something there that's not, they hit the brakes. In a city, that usually means they're stopped somewhere that's inconvenient. Going 65 miles an hour on the Mass Pike in a travel lane, that could mean a rear-end collision that could actually seriously injure somebody, right? So the federal standing order does not collect information, and neither does California, because when people are driving cars, if you are hit from behind, it's usually, right, we just assume in Massachusetts if you're hit by behind, it's the person who is behind you's fault. We need to know how much phantom braking autonomous cars are doing, so the reporting regime absolutely needs to include, not exclude, rear-end collisions, even if, for people-driven cars, we don't need to collect that information. So that's a very concrete example. That's why I say, like, we are really smart in Boston and Massachusetts. We have the experiences in other cities. We should be able to figure out the smartest data collection protocol in the country so that the cars get smarter, but we get smarter.
Before we go to our next question, I wanted to go back to something that Brendan said, which was exemptions being given out to companies like Uber and Lyft. And also a comment we got on YouTube that I found entertaining. Someone said, isn't a last mile shuttle with a self-driving car from a T-stop just recreating a bus route? Which I think is a fair point. And Darlene, as someone who's thinking about the jobs that could be lost during this, the idea that a bus route would just be replaced with self-driving cars, or that companies could just be getting exemptions. Jeff mentioned earlier lessons that could be learned from the introduction of ride-hailing apps like Uber and Lyft. Do you think there are lessons for Boston from situations like that upended an industry, upended the taxi cab industry? Do you think there are lessons for this moment as we see the introduction of self-driving vehicles?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I was trying to figure out how to insert this in there, because one of the lessons that, we're not anti-innovation. I mean, the idea around me being on this panel is actually just to remind people that there is a human cost. And so I just want to make sure that people understand that. And in particular, one example is that people have been using is the asbestos. Asbestos was seen as a very important innovation, and we sprayed it everywhere, in homes, in schools, in offices, and we are right now trying to still deal with the harmful effects. And what we're saying is here, with AI in particular and driverless cars, is we want to make sure that people are really studying and understanding the impacts before we cause all this harm. That asbestos, we're still cleaning that up. And so it's really important. I really agree with Stephanie here about the data. The data is so important, and that we're using our data, not industry. We're taking industry data and we're analyzing it for ourselves. That what has happened in the asbestos industry, they put out studies. We believed in the innovation. So we have to use our brains, our human brains, and remind ourselves that we will collect that data, but we need to analyze it and understand the impacts on humans and on our community.
Next question.
Yes, my name is Khalil. I'm from Salem, and I'm curious if any of you guys could expand on kind of really what the use case is for this technology in a Boston or Greater Boston context. When I look at where this technology has been implemented before, I see places like Phoenix and LA where they don't really have too robust of a public transportation system. It's either not used or it's very inefficient. And when you look at Boston and Greater Boston, we all have our gripes with the T, but it is much more widely used and it's in a much more small space. And so I'm curious, where we already do have Uber and Lyft, and we already do have the various facets of the T with the commuter rail and the Silver Line, et cetera, kind of how this really will sort of add into that public transportation infrastructure, or if a city like Boston really needs to fully embrace this technology in comparison to other places where public transit isn't as widely available or invested in.
Mark, what do you think?
I think you're going to see a progression. You're absolutely right. This isn't the easiest city or the best business case for a city to operate in for precisely the arguments you made. And it may well be that what the autonomous vehicles companies are really looking for in Massachusetts is to learn how to be smarter elsewhere. If you take the bad drivers, the bad roads, and the bad weather, and you use the technology and innovation base that we have here through the universities, then this could actually be the learning zone that they take elsewhere. So if I were putting my money on a bet, I think that's what's happening.
I also wanted to ask you, Jeff, since you are from another city that does have a robust public transportation system, is there a point of having self-driving taxis when you do have buses and trains that work pretty well?
Well, again, this is an evolutionary technology rather than revolutionary. It is kind of like Uber and Lyft, but with some interesting differences. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, if I've been out drinking and I'm going home to a hilly neighborhood where I live, public transit doesn't do a very good job of getting me back there. So, I use ride-hail regularly, and I actually, for some trips, prefer taking Waymo than taking an Uber or a Lyft. There are some very interesting use cases from users where particularly women, some neurodivergent folks, very much my friends who are non-gender conforming, feel a lot safer not having to interact with a human, particularly at 2 o'clock in the morning when there's no one else around, which is, I think, an invitation for existing ride-hail services to continue to do better and making sure that all of their passengers feel safe so that we don't feel like we have to remove the human in order for us to feel safe, because that is something that humans are incredibly good at, is knowing when I need to call emergency services because my passenger is in crisis, knowing how to de-escalate, seeing a frail passenger and knowing I need to wait 5 minutes to make sure that she gets all the way in her front door, right? I think the threat of autonomous vehicles could allow us to think about how do we continually improve regular yellow cab as well as Uber and Lyft services.
Let's go to our next audience question.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Abdulaziz Samantar. I'm a member of App Drivers Union. I believe Waymo now wants to come here to refine their technology and expand their profit. I have two questions. But what will happen to our jobs, and what will our communities get in return if we allow them?
Darlene.
I think we've said before that it is really important to have a study to really study the impact on jobs. There is no regulatory framework right now that is really looking at the impact on jobs, and Waymo themselves does not have an answer. We had a city council hearing on Councilor Santana's ordinance, and when asked the question, what's the impact on jobs, and they were like, I don't know. So they should be studying their own product and their own impact on jobs as well as we should. I know that we are struggling with trying to figure out how to deal with some of these issues that I think Waymo is trying to solve. The safety, the 2 a.m. issues, but a grander scheme of things in terms of what we need to be looking at, in my opinion, on this panel is investment in public transportation, investment in public transit. And if we can solve for that, if we can think about the creative ways in which we are taxing the billionaires for more investment in public transportation, instead of lining their pockets with new technologies like Waymo.
Is there anything that you think drivers or organizations who are concerned for drivers right now can and should be doing? I think a lot of people feel voiceless in this fear over what artificial intelligence is going to mean for my job. Am I going to have a job in 10 years? What can people do?
Well, the great thing is we do have an app drivers union that you can definitely join. We really believe that it is very important that workers together can have a voice and can have a say. When we're just trying to do this on our own, there's just really difficult. And so what an app drivers union does, or what unions do, is to remind people that they're not alone and that we can together come up with solutions. And then we join with our community partners, with government, to figure out the best solutions that actually put workers and our communities at the center.
All right, I think we're going to wrap up the conversation, but before we do that, ahead of the audience questions, I made each of you make a prediction about what's going to happen with autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars. Now I want to hear your hope for the future. Jeff, how do you hope this technology changes our lives, if at all?
I hope that this technology reminds cities like Boston that your entire economic future is rooted in being one of the few utterly delightfully walkable cities in North America, right? Your city needs to start from a position of unrelentingly delightful walkability. In order for the math of mobility to work, you then need to continue to invest in the T, so that is the primary way of getting around, particularly in main corridors. And that we then regulate the other services, whether it's Uber or Waymo, in order to fill in the gaps, making sure that we are aware of potential unintended consequences, manage around them, while also continuing to support innovation and continued improvement.
Stephanie, what's your hope or optimistic take for the future?
So my hope for the future starts with Vision Zero, which is no one should die or be seriously injured on a road in the United States. Yesterday was the International Day of Remembrance for victims of traffic violence, okay? And you go to one of these events and you never think the same way. So that I start from 0 deaths and serious injuries. If autonomous vehicles contribute getting us there faster and better, I am all for them. That is actually the use case. It's not a trip, it's safety. And if they don't, then we should we still need to achieve the vision of people not having to worry every time a loved one is on the street or behind the wheel that they're not going to make it home safely.
Mark, what's your hope? And do you think that autonomous vehicles could save, or could change the safety problem on roads?
I absolutely believe they can change the safety world that we operate in, and I would echo what you said. Vision Zero, great concept, been around for a long time, has had modest success. This has the potential to take 40,000 deaths, and even if it reduces it by 1,000 or 2,000, that is a big win, and that is what my hope is. Beyond that, it's to find a way to bring a new type of technology with a different economics in it, and sometimes a different environment in that Jeff described, to be part of the fabric of how we move people in this city and in the state.
Darlene, I know you have major qualms with the introduction of the technology, but it's here and could be in Boston soon. What's your hope?
My hope is that we really, as a society, as a community, really think about how AI and these new technology innovations really center and really work with human. Like we don't stop thinking about the human impact. And that we think about technology as helping workers do our jobs and not replacing workers. I would hope that we would really center our communities and make sure there's deeper investments in public transportation, in mobility, and making sure that workers are really at the center at the conversation when introducing AI and tech.
Darlene Lambos, President and Principal Officer of the Greater Boston Labor Council, Mark Fagan of the Harvard Kennedy School, Stephanie Pollack, the former Federal Highway Deputy Administrator and Secretary of MassDOT, and Jeff Tumlin, former Executive Director of SFMTA. Thank you all so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody who joined us today at the Newsfeed Cafe at the Boston Public Library. Thank you to the Newsfeed Cafe staff. Thank you to the GBH staff working here today. And thank you especially to Transportation for Massachusetts for organizing this conversation. I think some of our panelists might be able to stick around if you have more questions or want to chat with them. I'll be here for a little bit, but like a journalist, I'm on deadline for a story this afternoon, so I'll be leaving shortly. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much to everybody who streamed us online.
Thank you.
And thank you to Jeremy.
Thank you.